Okay, and we are now live. We have 2 attendees. 3, 2 of which are staff. There we go. Thank you. Are you ready for a roll call?
Yes, thank you, Madam Clerk.
Thank you. We'll start with Albany.
Yes, here.
Berkeley is excused. Dublin.
Here.
Dublin is on the line, yes. Thank you. Fremont is here. Thank you. Hayward.
Here.
Livermore.
Here.
Newark. Piedmont. Pleasanton.
Here.
San Leandro.
Present.
Tracy.
Present.
Union City.
Here.
Alameda County. They are expected to join. Emeryville.
Here.
Oakland.
Here, thank you.
And Community Advisory Committee.
Present.
Thank you. Thank you. You have a quorum.
Okay, we have quorum. Thank you. And I think what we'll do is first we'll do the public comment. And this will be public comment for the entire meeting. So anybody in the queue who wants to comment would raise their hand, is that right? Or somehow note they want to comment?
Yes, I have no signups on the public comment sheet.
Okay, if you are in the attendee list and you have the ability to raise your hand or somehow note, please do so now. I see a lot of attendees. Okay, Madam Clerk, can the attendees raise their hand? Is that possible?
Yes, they are able to raise their hand. Attendees will be limited today to only public comment to allow the flow of the retreat. So it'll just be the board question and answering with our consultant and staff. And then the public is welcome to submit comments through the public comment sheet or to cob@ebce.org.
Okay, so last call to all the attendees. Thank you for joining and for listening in to this informational retreat. There are no action items today, but if there are any comments from the public, now's the time to raise your hand. I'm not seeing any. So, okay, so let's go on to the main part of the agenda, the power procurement for renewables overview and slideshow.
Right.
Mr. Chair, I'm on.
Thank you. And also Newark has confirmed that they're on the call.
Oh,
So
great.
Alameda County and Newark are on.
Excellent.
All right. Thanks very much. I am, excuse me, I am loading my screen to share right now. I think I'm sharing the right thing. Let's see. Do you see a slide that says board retreat power procurement overview? Awesome. Okay, thank
Yes.
you. Well, thanks very much for joining me today. I'm sorry, but it's going to be a lot of me talking over the course of the next 3-ish hours. And our consultant, Tim Belden from Energy GPS, will also be joining us.
Can I ask a procedural question then?
Of
Would you
course.
prefer that we jump in at any time with questions, or will you pause for questions, or should we leave all the questions to the end?
Please jump in at any time with questions. I have the agenda, the list of topics on the screen right now. And so Tim's section is section 4, the discussion of solar risk. I've asked Tim to join us at about 5:40 p.m. And I'm targeting to have a couple of 5-minute bathroom and stretch your leg breaks during the course of this session. So, you know, I'm at certain points in time, if we're running over schedule, in an attempt to be respectful of Tim's time, I might make notes of questions and ask that we come back to them later. But otherwise, please just jump in whenever things come up.
Okay, thank you for that.
Okay, great. So here's our agenda for today. The first section, which is about 20 slides or 15 slides, is an overview of previous board retreat materials. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of them. I pulled select materials into this deck because I know that there are about 3 new board members, and I thought that these materials from previous board presentations were directly relevant to the info that we're going to be going through today. And so, I thought it'd be helpful for review purposes, either as we go through the meeting, or if you want to go back and look at it on your own after the meeting. So we'll do a quick overview. Then we'll spend some time talking about some of the key compliance rules that EBCE has to operate under. In the third section, we'll talk about how do we build a portfolio of resources. And in our case, it's primarily a portfolio of renewable portfolio standard renewable energy resources. Then Tim will join us and we'll talk about the risk associated with a portfolio that's very heavy in solar energy. And then I'll wrap things up and I'll talk about other risks that EBCE faces. Okay, section 1, refresher. As I mentioned, I'm not going to go through and actually talk through the details on every single slide, but for those who are not familiar, this is a map of the different balancing areas in California. The CAISO, California ISO, or CAISO, is the largest balancing area, but there are parts of the state, notably LADWP and SMUD, that are actually not part of the CAISO market. Here is a list of different wholesale energy market products that are transacted. Most of these are transacted through the CAISO energy markets. The notable exception is natural gas, but we do transact energy. Transmission capacity is made available through the CAISO. We transact the capacity or resource adequacy product, mostly bilaterally to meet Public Utilities Commission requirements. Congestion revenue rights are a form of financial transaction that we do for hedging purposes, and those are available through the CAISO. And then there's a secondary market or a bilateral market for renewable energy products, mostly in the form of renewable energy credits. What drives energy market prices? So the items on this page are primary drivers of market prices. There are 2 things that I specifically want to call out here. First is that the term hydrology refers to the study of water and water conditions. Because California has a large hydro generating system, and we also import a lot of water from the Pacific Northwest, it's very important that we be aware of what's going on in terms of the amount of water in the state, the amount of rainfall, and the amount of snowpack. I'm sure we all remember just a few years ago when we were in the worst drought in California recorded history. That had a meaningful impact on energy market prices because the lack of rainfall and the lack of snowpack meant there was less hydro generation available in the spring and summer months. The second thing that I want to note is something that is missing from this slide. When this was discussed previously, congestion on the transmission system was not called out as a major driver of price volatility, but it is a major driver, and it's something that is harder for us to predict. So congestion it's like a bottleneck. If you take a wine bottle and dump it straight down, all of the wine can't flow through right away. There's a bottleneck and it forces the liquid leaving the bottle to move at a slower pace. The same thing happens on transmission lines. They can only carry so much energy at a certain point in time. So if we have more renewable energy generating than we were expecting, that can cause congestion. Or if a transmission line becomes unavailable abruptly through a forced outage, that can negatively impact other lines in its area, because all of the energy that was flowing on that line that went out of service is now forced to try to flow on the other lines, and you essentially get the electric transmission system equivalent of a bottleneck. And so that can be a huge driver of price spikes. And it's not something that we can predict, really.
Hey, Marie, this is Howard. I would just want to tackle one thing related to hydrology. One is that, when you're dealing with renewable energy, there's natural intermittency and variability day to day, but you oftentimes across a year will have a fairly consistent amount of sunlight and wind. And so while there's within the year quite a bit of intermittency you have to manage for throughout the year, there's a fairly reliable amount of sunlight and therefore energy that you'll get from solar plants. It'll just change day to day. With hydrology, there's a much more significant impact across years. This year, 2020 as an example, is a fairly dry year, just in comparison to historical years. Last year was a very wet year. In California, it was a very wet year. However, locationally speaking, actually, Pacific Northwest outside of California was a fairly dry year. So those are like really interesting dynamics to be aware of that actually have pretty significant impacts on energy market prices based off of what is the rainfall in California, what is the rainfall outside of California. And that can have pretty significant impacts on our energy market prices depending on the season, such as in the spring, where you get a lot of melting and runoff that would have certain effects on energy market prices, such as bringing them down in the spring time frame. And then of course in the summer, if you're in a drought season, then you don't really have any reserves or storage to help address that.
Thanks, Howard. Great call out. This slide gives an overview of the roles of the day-ahead CAISO market and the real-time CAISO market. The call out that I want to make here, particularly rather than going into what all of the acronyms are on this page, the call out that I want to make here is just to point out that in the day-ahead market, supply and demand clear on an hourly basis. And in the real-time market singular is a bit of a misnomer because it's actually there are two settlement intervals. There's a 15-minute market settlement period for supply and demand, and there's a 5-minute settlement period. This slide is a great image to represent all of the generating points in the CAISO. All of these points are called P nodes or pricing nodes, and prices are generated at all of these points on a day-ahead hourly basis and in the real time at 15 minutes and 5 minutes. The key takeaway here is that the locational marginal price at any given pricing node is comprised of 3 components that make up the cost of the resource. The first is the system marginal energy cost. The second is the marginal cost of losses. And the third is the marginal cost of congestion. So these are the 3 components that determine, why is a green dot green versus a yellow dot yellow. And I want to call out the difference in colors on this map because it's demonstrating that prices are not the same at every point. The impact of congestion can be a major driver in price differences. The marginal cost of producing energy at a given point can also be a driver of prices. But what I want to demonstrate with this map is that when EBCE goes out to the market and thinks about what long-term resources should we execute contracts with, location matters. So obviously we want resources that are in Alameda County because that's valuable to us. We also want to look at, is the resource in a location that has problems with congestion? Is the resource, and we can only look at what's happened to date. There's no way for us to predict what's going to happen in the future, but we can try to get a sense of, is this resource in a place where its generation is more likely to be valuable or more valuable to the energy market than a comparable resource that's in a different area. all of those dots that I just showed you effectively roll up into the 3 zones that are on this map. These zones were established before the CAISO went to a locational marginal price market structure. They're called existing zones, and they're existing zones of generation or generation trade hubs. And what they're used for is to represent the average price that's paid to generation that exists within these zones. So let me go back one. You know, a lot of the green dots are located in the NP15 zone. There's some yellow dots that are kind of in the middle. That's close to ZP26, could be SP15. And then there were some dots that are down south in the LA San Diego region. And so those would be contributing to what we view as the average price in the SP15 zone. So we might talk about an individual node's price, or we might talk about like generation zone, these more regional prices.
I'd like to jump in with a question and perhaps display my ignorance here. But I know that we've purchased energy at certain prices. I imagine at certain fixed prices. So what you're showing us now, does this apply to all the energy that we can't purchase in long-term contracts and we have to purchase on the market? Is that the difference?
Sort of. So when I'm going to try to answer this question, and let me know if I'm answering a question that's different from what you're actually asking. So we've executed a number of long-term contracts, and none of them have been fully built and are connected to the system yet. So someday there will be additional dots on the map that represent our long-term renewable energy resources. We also enter into short-term transactions where we're buying power that serves as a hedge. I'm going to talk about this a lot more later on, so I don't want to go into the weeds on it right now, but when we enter into a short-term transaction to buy power, you know, according to a certain schedule, it's protecting us from price uncertainty and price variability. And so our long-term renewable resources will be additional dots on this map someday, and when they generate, they will be paid whatever price the CAISO assigns to them at the relevant node. But it won't really be them being paid, it will be us being paid. So like a wind farm that we've executed or let's say a solar farm that's somewhere in Southern California, we will pay that solar farm its contract price, and then we will basically get the market revenues, or what the CAISO determines the value of its generation is. And so that's how we offset what we're paying for the contract price by reaping the benefit of the energy market revenues. Is that answering your question?
I think so. I think I'm not very good at this stuff at all, but that definitely made some sense to me. Thank you.
Let me add in a couple additional points. One is to simply say, when you go sign a contract to go hedge your energy, you can do that at a particular P node, or you can do that as a broader hedge, such as our DLAP, which is an aggregation of all of the P nodes within the PG&E territory. And that directly reflects our own cost for what we pay for energy. Or you can do it on a zonal basis, such as NP15. So you can structure a hedge in a different way as an individual P node or as an aggregation of certain points. And it will serve as, you know, a slightly better or slightly worse hedge for our actual costs, depending on how you structure that. And of course, you are paying a different price as a result of that. So if you go actually back one slide, Marie, just elaborate on one more point. There's something like 10,000 pricing points throughout CAISO and areas that deliver into CAISO. So there is a lot, right? And generally, when you look at a map like this, the colors tend to be about the same. When things are green, they're usually green and you get some yellow. And when things are red, it's usually all red. You might get some yellow. It's rare that you'd sort of like a complete like mismatch of like some green, some red, because it kind of flows together. On high demand days, things start to turn red. On low demand days, they generally are more green. I'm noting this because, for the contracts that we've signed for all of our long-term PPAs, they're a mix. Some of them specifically are P nodes. All the projects deliver at a P node. That's how it works. But the way that we structure our contract as a hedge, they are either buying at the P node and saying, we're going to pay you a fixed price based off of the P node price, or it may actually be a price in our contract that's based off of an aggregation of certain points that will serve as a better hedge for us. And that's all, again, relating to more of how you manage the risk, which Maria will touch on in a little bit more detail. But you can structure it both ways is the short answer. But the reality is it's all getting delivered at a particular P node. Generation units at a P node.
Thank you very much.
We now have a few slides that I can skip over. Good news. We'll be talking about risk management in the later portion of the presentation, actually in the last section. So I included these because they're good. This slide, and this slide because they're good background, but we will be talking about risk management principles in the last section of the presentation. This is also great information that was from the June 2019 board presentation. I'm going to skip over it also because Tim Belden will be talking about the impact of specifically solar generation at certain levels of penetration later on. I'm not going to talk through this slide, but I just want to flag it for the board, sort of selfishly, because in a couple of weeks, I'll be providing the board another update on our integrated resource planning process, and I'll be asking you to sign off on the analysis that we've done for compliance purposes. And then in September, we'll be coming back and talking about IRP analysis for our own internal goal setting purposes. And so some of these integration studies, you might want to go back and just take a look at and think about in relation to that integrated resource planning work. So I thought it was worth including and giving a shout out to the IRP work. Okay, plant retirements. This definitely is worth mentioning. The main call out that I want to make here is that Diablo Canyon and various natural gas plant retirements are impacting the CAISO system in a very significant way. One of the most immediate impacts we're seeing is that California is becoming, as of this year and going into next year, will become even more short on resource adequacy. As much as we don't want to use these resources to serve our customers' energy needs, they actually play a really significant role in ensuring system reliability. And as they retire, it creates a big gap. There's a brown box in the bottom right that says that all of this 6 gigawatt hours of firm capacity will have to be replaced with renewables and energy storage. In a little while, I'll talk about why renewable resources and storage don't count for capacity as much as natural gas plants do. But what I want to call out here is that Mike Susko from the Power Resources team did a terrific analysis recently that demonstrated that with the retirement of once-through cooling plants and with changes that the CPUC made to RA rules and how renewable resources count for RA, we are seeing a significant shortfall in the amount of resource adequacy that's available to us this year and going into next year. And EBCE has a very real risk of being short in meeting our resource adequacy compliance obligations because there's not enough capacity on the system. I'll talk about this more in a little bit also, but I just wanted to flag that in relation to this slide. Effective load carrying capacity, ELCC. This is basically the tool that the Public Utilities Commission uses to determine how much value or how much credit, capacity value or credit, they should assume different types of resources have. And it's really a way of measuring the certainty that an individual resource type will be able to generate when there's demand for that generation. The best way that I can think of to explain it is through an example. If you have a 100 megawatt gas plant, it counts as having 100% ELCC. If you have a 100 megawatt wind farm, the CPUC says that in some months it only has 14% ELCC. If you have a 100 megawatt solar farm, in some months the CPUC says that it has 2% ELCC. The 14 and the 2% are actually real numbers. Those are not examples. But it is important for me to clarify that these ELCC values, the percentages, change on a monthly basis. So in some months, solar is worth a little bit more. In some months, it's worth less. But it never gets 100% credit. A gas plant can get 100% credit. It can get less also due to a variety of factors. But the renewable resources and hydro never get 100% credit. And so one of the practical applications of that is that it's virtually impossible for us to use all renewable resources to meet our capacity or our resource adequacy showing obligations. This slide demonstrates how ELCC values have changed over time. In early 2019, the Public Utilities Commission actually lowered how they count the ELCC values of different resources. So in the top graph, you see that on average, solar was worth more previously, and now solar on average is worth less. And the same thing happened with wind. Wind was worth more, and it is on average worth less today.
Hey, Marie, one thing I would just highlight there is the reason that this number changes is because CAISO and CPUC are looking specifically at when the peak is on a particular day, a particular month of the year. And so when they look at the grid and they say, middle of the day when it's particularly hot, you generally have your peak. And as you put more and more solar on the grid, of course, where it generally generates in that peak of the day, then there's something called the net peak, which is the peak if you net out the solar production. And so that is generally coming from production of dispatchable resources. And that net peak gets pushed later and later into the day as you add more solar on. And so you're now getting into the evening hours where solar is coming off production, and you need to start generating through sources like natural gas. And that's a really critical factor that drives this ELCC number down, because as you add more and more solar, it turns out it doesn't do a whole lot for you for this net peak number. And I think that's been a recognition that the CAISO and CPUC have made now over time, and refined this analysis to say, yeah, we used to think you could get a whole bunch of capacity value from solar, but it turns out as you add more solar now, it's not really doing anything for our net peak. And so those numbers are continuing to drop more and more. And I just highlight that because as Marie noted, you can't serve all of your capacity needs in the state just. And so as we try to meet SB 100 in our path towards clean resources, this is one of our biggest challenges as a grid that we have to solve. And we look to storage to solve a lot of that, but that's looking to one technology to do a lot of work for addressing that net peak need. And so there's no clear solution on this particular point, but just really want to highlight the risk and part of the challenge of us and all load serving entities sort of complying with the different capacity requirements in the market as we're seeing values decline for what we primarily want to buy, which is renewable energy.
That's, Howard, you perfectly teed up the next slide, which is what E3 estimated the declining ELCCs would be for energy, for 4-hour energy storage resources over time. I don't know, can you guys see my cursor moving around on this page? Okay, great. You see this, oops, let me go back one, I shouldn't have clicked. This light brown dot out here, E3 estimates that when 40% of the CAISO system peak is filled with energy storage, the ELCC value, the way that it counts for RA, will be like 10% of the nameplate. So because storage doesn't really generate itself, it doesn't produce energy on its own, you have to have solar to charge from renewable over generation to then put more energy on the grid, that stored energy onto the grid. But over time, there's estimated to be a declining value associated with doing that from 4-hour storage resources. And so it just goes to Howard's point that, you know, going all in on solar or all in on solar plus storage won't actually work from a system reliability perspective.
I'll jump in with one more point here too, just sort of a good continuation of my last statement, which is just like solar and wind are going down, battery is going down. And it's a similar issue where you have 4-hour duration battery. Over time, you just need the batteries to last longer and longer, right? Because you want to run if you have more penetration of renewables, that renewables has to be stored, particularly when the bulk of that is provided by solar. It has to be stored in storage to be able to be utilized overnight if you want to transition away from natural gas. And so right now, the requirement is that your battery storage has to last 4 hours to count as 1 unit of resource adequacy. And we all know that that requirement will increase over time. CAISO, CPUC has said that. It will go up to 6, it will go up to 8, it will continue to increase. And so what we're buying today in terms of storage from a resource adequacy perspective is going to decline in value based off of just compliance rule changes. As the grid sort of adapts to new resources coming online, that storage duration requirement will increase.
Exactly. Okay, that is the end of the wrap up or the overview section, overview of previous material. Now we're going to move into an overview of some of the key compliance rules.
Why don't we, thank you, Marie. So since we finished that first section and there were some meaty things in there, are there any questions from board members on section 1 before that kind of gets lost in our brains?
I know I have one.
Who's that?
And yeah, this is Mary.
Mary, go ahead.
Back one slide. This is the first time I've heard of this. It's really interesting, and I'm wondering about the technology of storage batteries in terms of 6, 8, and 12 hours and costs. Because if we wanted to try and even get an 8-hour storage battery, I don't even know that those are available at this point, but maybe they are. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So, you know, when we talk about energy storage, we mostly talk about a 4-hour lithium-ion battery. Lithium-ion's been around for a long time. It was in cameras and cell phones. It's been in cars. So it's a well-established, well-known technology, and it's relatively affordable because it's been produced in large quantities for a really long time now. There are other forms of energy storage that might be newer and might be more expensive, but they do exist. So one form is a flow battery, and I'm going to give a really high level explanation, but think of a flow battery as 2 giant vats of liquid that have a positive charged ions and negative charged ions, and they basically get poured back and forth into each other, and that ionic reaction generates energy. And then, I don't know how, but somehow the positive and the negative ions come out and like go through a process that draws energy from the grid. So that's the charging portion, and then the discharging is when they get poured together and they generate energy. So flow batteries are a newer technology. They have promise. They have a lot of possibility. There's compressed air energy storage, which is literally compressing air, typically into underground caverns, like open caverns that were previously held natural gas. That's very, very expensive. And then there are some kind of quirky technologies. One of them I describe as a chairlift that pulls rocks up and down a hill. So there are some newer, more eccentric energy storage technologies that have potential to provide longer duration energy storage. Like
it sounds like nothing now. So if we want, I mean, we can't really be forward looking in terms of purchasing longer storage that will last longer.
We are starting to be forward looking and look at EBCE took part in an effort with a collection of community choice aggregators, and we actually released a long duration storage request for information a few weeks ago, and we actually should be getting responses today. So I haven't seen any of the responses yet, but we are looking to the market to see what resources are available and try to get a sense of what the costs are. And if there's anything compelling, we might go out and do a full RFO and try to execute contracts, or it's something that we will definitely be looking at doing in the coming years.
Thank you.
And I'll just add that I think that's right. Today, there's limited cost-effective sources of long-duration storage. I think everyone in the energy markets acknowledge there's a need for that soon. And so, there are mandates from the CPUC to look at that and start addressing that need. And as we just mentioned, we are, being active on that front and having this RFI out there. We are looking to sign, a couple pilot projects here over the coming years as a way to sort of test that technology. And it may be a bit more pricey, but understanding that it's necessary, we are starting to explore that.
Thank you. Mike from Newark, you have a question?
Yeah, actually, I have 3 quick questions, and I apologize for coming in late. I had trouble with my computer. Again, being a new member to this board, some of the terminology that you use is new to me as well. So I apologize for these questions. What is CAISO? What does that stand for?
It stands for California Independent System Operator. They run the energy market in the state, and they're responsible for looking at all of the transmission lines in the state and making sure that there's enough transmission capacity for energy to flow from generating source to demand sink.
Thank you. If you go back to the map that you had of California showing the various different colors, one more. Yeah, is this a point in time, like a specific day, a specific hour? I'm assuming that's the case when energy is being purchased at a specific point in time. Could you describe what that point of time was?
Sure. Because this was taken from a previous board retreat, I don't know if it was meant to represent a 5-minute or 15-minute settlement, but
okay.
it could have been either a day ahead map or a real-time map. So if it was day ahead, it would have been hourly prices. In all likelihood, it was probably real-time 5-minute prices.
And then my last question, I thought a chart later or two, you talked about kind of deficiency in terms of the various energy sources that would be available for us to purchase. I think you were mentioning solar and wind, that there would not be as many renewables available for us to purchase. Did I understand that correctly?
I think it might have been when I was talking about power plant retirements.
Mm-hmm.
And this slide where we're talking about Diablo Canyon coming offline and these once through cooling natural gas plants. There was this brown box that had been displayed in the June 2019 board meeting where E3 said that they estimate that 6 gigawatts of new firm capacity is needed by 2025, and that all of it would have to be replaced with renewables and energy storage. Because of what I talked about with the ELCCs and how you know, a 100 megawatt gas plant counts for 100 megawatts of capacity, but 100 megawatts of solar counts for, you know, about 14 megawatts of capacity on average throughout the year. It's virtually impossible for us to fill our capacity obligation just with renewables, but there are other ways that we can transact to fill up that capacity position, including with energy storage or by buying capacity, which is not the same as energy, from a natural gas plant.
And my last point on this particular chart, I was one of the board members that voted to continue with the nuclear energy. Would that have assisted us in meeting our renewable energy goals? And if so, was the board advised of that at the time that they made that decision?
It would not have, nuclear energy does not count towards our renewable energy obligation. So if we had accepted energy from the nuclear power plant, it would not have helped us meet our renewable energy allocation, or excuse me, compliance requirements. Off the top of my head, I do not believe that we were getting capacity associated with that allocation.
We did not. That's correct. We did not get any capacity. The reality is of that situation with nuclear is that plant's operating through 2025 regardless.
Right.
Except the allocation or not. So the capacity is there to serve the market regardless. And our acceptance of the allocation, if we had, would not have included capacity anyways.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
In a few minutes, I'm going to, well, in like an hour really, I'm going to show you some slides that talk about our open energy position and how we can close our energy position. That's where that energy from Diablo would have fit in.
Thank you for answering my questions. I appreciate your patience.
My pleasure.
Okay, let's see. Mayor Pilch from Albany.
Yes, hi. Just briefly, I'm wondering if you could tell me about the efficiency of the different battery storage options that you mentioned: lithium ion, water, compressed air, etc.
You know, unfortunately, I don't have any statistics related to their efficiency readily available or off the top of my head. You know, I apologize about that.
I think we can definitely, you know, this has been an area of interest in the past. You know, when we get the results of the RFI, I would suggest we present another item to the board at that point and maybe inform some options there. But the short answer, different technologies, depending on the use case, you know, there's different value for it, and we can maybe speak to that as a follow-up.
Okay, thank you for that. Thanks.
And I am making a note about that question.
Thank you. Okay, I think we can go on to the section 2 now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, and these are some of our, you know, large key compliance rules. By no means is this an exhaustive list. There's no shortage of compliance rules in California. So I've already mentioned resource adequacy a number of times. Resource adequacy is the term that the Public Utilities Commission uses to measure how much capacity or ability to produce energy exists in the state. There are 3 types of resource adequacy requirements. The first is a system RA requirement. Second is local, and third is flexible. We will go through some slides for each of them. The system and local requirements are measured using this term net qualifying capacity, NQC. And NQC is basically the effective load carrying capability, that percentage number multiplied by the nameplate value of a generating resource. So going back to my previous examples, the 100 megawatt gas plant that can count as 100 megawatts of ELCC, or excuse me, 100% ELCC, that's 100 times 1. So its NQC is 100. The solar resource that we talked about, 100 megawatts of solar that has the ELCCs that change every month on the graph, its average throughout the course of the year is about 14.25%. So the average NQC of a 100 megawatt solar resource is 14.25. So that's, NQC is what we refer to when we're tracking how much value a plant counts for our system RA obligation. But what is the obligation itself? Every load serving entity's requirement is calculated based on the California Energy Commission's forecast demand. So they estimate what's your peak forecast for demand, and then basically they add a 15% margin on top of it. So, and these forecast demands do change on a monthly basis. So in some months we might have, our total forecast demand might be something like 900 megawatts, of peak demand. Well, then we would have to have capacity under contract for 900 megawatts plus 15%. This is a high level description. There's a little bit more detail that goes into it, but at a high level, this is how it works. So our total obligation that we have to fill, or the compliance requirement we have to do, happens on a monthly basis. And we already know from previous discussion that the way that resources count to this towards meeting this obligation also changes on a monthly basis. So throughout the course of a year, we're keeping track of a lot of different numbers that are changing up and down over time. To demonstrate that we are compliant with our resource adequacy obligations, we have to make showings to both the Public Utilities Commission and to the CAISO. And so the first showing we do is an annual showing. We demonstrate on a year ahead basis that we've procured 90% of our system RA obligation for the 5 summer months. They really care about the summer because that's when demand is the highest. And so we demonstrate that we've done that for the coming year. Then on a month ahead basis, we have to demonstrate to the Utilities Commission and the CAISO that we have filled 100% of our system RA obligations. If we don't have 100% filled, we can face financial penalties. And I'm flagging that because you remember a few slides ago, I talked about the fact that we can already see that there's insufficient capacity on the system this year, and it gets even worse next year. So it does create a financial risk for EBCE, and it's something that we're working very hard to avoid negatively impacting the organization. The local resource adequacy can be thought of as sort of a carve out from system. I'm going to talk about this point that says update recent CPUC decision. I'll talk about that in a second, but to think about how local RA works today, going back to my previous example, let's say we had a 900 megawatt system requirement in a given month. A portion of that requirement would be, maybe 400 megawatts would be a local requirement, and it would require that 400 megawatts of capacity come from certain local areas. Because EBCE is in the PG&E service territory, or the service load pocket, all of our local requirements are throughout the PG&E region. So it's on this map, we have requirements in Humboldt, North Coast Bay Area, Sierra, Stockton, Greater Bay Area, and Fresno, actually Fresno and Kern. We do not have requirements in Big Creek, Ventura, LA Basin, or San Diego. So 900 megawatt total requirement, a portion of it is individual amounts, maybe like 20 megawatts Humboldt, 200 megawatts Bay Area, and so on and so forth to break up to that 400 megawatt requirement. The requirement is calculated by the CAISO. They do it on an annual basis, and unfortunately, their study process has always been a bit of a black box. So there's not a whole lot I can tell you about it, except to say that it's generally based on a load serving entity's load share ratio when we look at total August system demand. But the actual details of how they calculate it, I've never been able to break into the black box and figure out. Now, going back to this point on the top of the page, starting in 2023, there's been a rule change. And so starting in 2023, we won't technically have to meet our own local RA requirement anymore, where we won't have to do the showings ourselves. There will be a central procurement entity that will be responsible for doing the local RA showings. Now, to the extent that we have resources under contract that can count for local RA, we can bid those resources into the central procurement entity. And if it's a competitive price, then the bid will be picked up and we'll get paid for it. If our price is too high, we can just give it to them and not get paid for it. And then this will help lower everyone's local RA obligation, but like we don't get credit for it. So it's an unfortunate rule change. The downside is we're concerned that some entities may not show their local resources because they may not get full credit for them. The upside is having one buyer doing all of this local procurement, in theory, should limit any market power that the sellers have, because there are limited sellers of local capacity. This next slide is sort of an example of how we track our local RA position. Now, this is not EBCE specific because this deck is available to the public. I didn't want to put out any commercially sensitive information, but this looks at generally how we would track our local RA position. And so this is actually showing that for 2020, in the year ahead showing, there were a number of load serving entities that were deficient in all of these different local areas throughout the year. We track the same thing for ourselves, with the exception that we don't have a row for LA Basin. We don't have a row for San Diego, and Ventura isn't even on here. But we look at how are we doing in terms of meeting our Bay Area, Fresno, et cetera, obligations for every month of the year over time. Okay, the third area is flexible resource adequacy, and where local and system resource adequacy are related to each other, flexible is very different. Local and system are measured using the term net qualifying capability. Flexible is measured using the term effective flexible capacity. Actually, getting ahead of myself, I'll talk about that in just one second. The flexible RA obligation is calculated also by the CAISO. And so what they do is they look at all of the renewable generation that they forecast to be in the market on a monthly basis. And then they calculate what is the maximum 3-hour net load curve. So you have the total demand curve, and then you take out the renewable generation, and that sort of changes the shape of the curve. And then from the lowest point to the highest point, the lowest point of demand to the highest point of demand, the CAISO calculates what is that ramp over 3 hours, and then they figure out what is each load serving entity's contribution to that ramping need. And from there, they assign out monthly requirements for demonstrating that there are flexible resources on the system. That brings me to effective flexible capacity. So different resources can provide different types of effective flexible capacity. A resource like Diablo Canyon that just generates, it doesn't go up, it doesn't go down, that doesn't have any flexible capacity. It has regular capacity, but none of it is flexible. You can't tell it generate more, generate less. A gas plant, you can tell generate more, generate less. And so resources that are able to provide some flexibility fit into one of these three categories. The CAISO was smart when it set this up and recognized that some resources, like a gas plant, provide a lot of flexibility. Gas plant, a large hydro plant, they can provide a lot of flexibility. And then some resources like demand response, they're they can't provide as much flexibility. They're not available for 17 hours. So the CAISO didn't want load serving entities like EBCE, they didn't want us to just make available these resources that are less valuable. So when we make our flexible capacity showings, we can have as much as we want from the category 1, the most valuable category, but we're limited in terms of how much of the other 2 categories we can use to meet our compliance obligations. I'm going to transition now to another area of compliance requirements. Before I do that, any questions about resource adequacy? Okay. You know where to find me if anything comes up. Okay, the Renewable Portfolio Standard. In the interest of time, I'm not going to walk through all of these definitions, but what I do want to call out is this first bullet. Well, the first 2 bullets really. Under SB 350, 60% of the energy that we use to serve our customers' demand has to come from eligible renewable resources by 2030. Under SB 100, we have to have 100% greenhouse gas free resources by 2025. So the 60% renewable NEP in California at this point in time does not ever increase to 100% renewable, but it does have to increase to 100% carbon free. So what's the difference between renewable and carbon free? It's really hydro. A hydro resource that is smaller than 40 megawatts in nameplate capacity counts as renewable. A hydro resource that's 40 megawatts or greater does not count as renewable. It's an administrative rule that has been in place since the beginning of the RPS program in California. So hydro resources will continue to be very important to us for a long time in California because of this 100% GHG free requirement. This slide shows how the requirements increase over time. When the RPS program was set up, I think that the Public Utilities Commission and the legislature did something very smart here as well. Rather than telling us that you have an annual requirement, you have to be like 33% renewable in 2020, our compliance with the requirements is measured over a compliance period. Most compliance periods are 3 years long. Compliance period number 4, which is the next one, is an exception. It's 4 years long. But the way it works is we have targets for each year's compliance, but our actual compliance with the obligation is measured over the entire compliance period. So in 2021, EBCE is targeting more than 36, but the state is targeting 36% renewable energy. In the next year, 39, 41, 44. But the total requirement for the 4-year period is 40% renewable energy over the course of these 4 years. The reason that this was done is back in 2002, when the RPS first went into effect, the state was unsure that number one, that we'd even be able to get enough resources online, but they also recognized that, from one day to the next, solar and wind generation can vary dramatically. And you can have climate and weather change so that one year it's a lot sunnier or a lot windier and so on and so forth. And so that's why we're not just looking at individual year targets. It's done over periods of time. The other thing that I want to call out is this bullet right here. SB 350 requires that 65% of eligible purchases come from contracts 10 years or longer starting in 2021. Today, in compliance period 3, we can use as many short-term contracts as we want to meet our compliance obligations, but when we do our compliance period 4 showings and demonstrate compliance to the Utilities Commission, we'll have to demonstrate that 65% of that 40% for the whole compliance period, 65% of it came from long-term contracts. This slide shows the 3 different types of credits that we can use to demonstrate compliance with the RPS. A REC is a renewable energy credit or renewable energy certificate. And I think of it as like it's like your stock certificate for having purchased something, or your receipt for having purchased something. So there are, without going into too much detail, there are these 3 different types. PCC1, Portfolio Content Category 1, is the most valuable. These are resources that are either in California or are directly connected to the California grid. And so the requirement is that 75% of our compliance has to come from this type of resources. And then we can, PCC3 is unbundled RECs. There's no like energy that goes along with it. It's just demonstrating that you bought a green attribute. You can do up to 10% from PCC3s. The remainder can come from this other category, Portfolio Content Category 2. Any questions on the Renewable Portfolio Standard rules before I move on to Power Content Label?
Any questions? Yeah, Mike Hannon, please.
Yes, thank you. It seems like there's going to be a significant demand on renewable energy throughout the state of California. It sounds like that might be a real challenge for a lot of these organizations to meet that renewable energy requirement. So I'd like to that. And then secondly, as technology and science moves forward, do you envision other renewable resources out there that we will be tapping into that maybe are not commonly known to consumers today? Thank you.
I think I misheard part of your question, Mike. The first part was, it seems like it's going to be very challenging to meet the requirement, but it cut out a little bit.
Yeah, so I would be interested in your thoughts as to, one, is that going to be a concern for all of us trying to meet that renewable target? So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. And if it is a challenge, what are we going to do to meet that requirement? And did you understand my second question or comment?
Yes, the second question was what are the other types of resources in solar? I'll answer your second question first. We talk about wind and solar a lot because solar in particular is the cheapest renewable resource right now. And so we see a lot of load serving entities like ourselves buying energy from solar because it's cheap. Wind has been around for a long time. It's not as cheap as solar, but it's relatively inexpensive also. There are other types of renewable resources. Small hydro is one. Geothermal energy is another type of renewable resource. Biomass, so like the burning of, for example, forest waste, is a type of renewable energy, and then biogas is another type. And then we're seeing exciting developments with things like offshore wind resources. So there are other types, and we are looking at them. You'll hear more about them a little bit in this presentation, and certainly as we talk about the integrated resource planning process. And then your question about the challenge of meeting the RPS. I'm not worried about our ability to meet this increasing RPS requirement. I am worried, and we'll talk about this a little bit later this evening, I am worried about the nature of renewable generation and having a lot of solar generation in the middle of the day, but open positions in the morning and late at night. And so later on, we'll talk about our thoughts and some of the things that we're doing to try to mitigate the risks associated with that.
One thing I want to clarify is the challenges that we noted earlier related to procuring renewable energy, that was more focused on capacity, so resource adequacy as the product. And what we're talking about here in terms of these requirements for RPS and for SB 350 That's related to the energy that you procure. And so I just want to make sure that we distinguish between those two things.
Okay, great. Great, thank you.
Okay, let's move on. Thank you.
Okay, so power content label and emissions reporting. The board has likely seen this power content label before. That was our 2018 power content label that was released in the fall of 2019. The power content label is something we produce on an annual basis to show our customers the accounting behind what their energy use is. I'm describing it as accounting because the power content label reflects what we paid for in terms of energy. It's not really, at this time, it's not really possible to direct certain electricity from certain resources to individual customers. It's the laws of physics and the way that power flows work just don't actually allow that. It might be in the future, but not today. So the power content label allows us to say, you know, what we paid for different types of energy for different customer groups. An example is a direct transaction when we get electricity from a solar resource under a long-term power purchase agreement, a long-term contract. That would show up in this solar line. Another example is when we do a fixed price energy transaction that might come through a supplier like Bonneville Power Authority, which is up in Washington. And that transaction, in that transaction, we might be buying electricity from a specific resource, or it could be from sort of a collection of resources. And so after the fact, we have to do this matching up an accounting process to figure out what actual resources do we know we got electricity from versus what sort of general buckets of resources did we buy. When we buy energy from the CAISO market or from an unspecified source somewhere up in Washington, that shows up in this unspecified source of power row. And all of these different rows have a different emissions factor associated with them. So if we bought 1,000 gigawatt hours of solar energy and 200 of wind, there's no emissions associated with that. But whatever energy that came from geothermal or from unspecified power sources, each of these row items has a certain emissions factor that we have to use as a multiplier to calculate our total emissions. And so the power content label shows the percentage of the resource mix. I'll come back to this in a second. Emissions reporting is where we actually say emissions times amount of energy equals a certain amount of greenhouse gas associated with our total energy usage. I'm kind of jumping around here, but I'm going to come back to this slide also. So the way that we handle our power content label, the rules recently changed, and the rules, let's see. The rules are going into effect now for energy that was already purchased and delivered in 2019. Gets on here. So yeah, these rules are going into effect now for energy that was already purchased and was already delivered and used in 2019. But because of the way we do power content label reporting, it's an after the fact process. Our customers will get something in the mail showing this late in this fall, but it will actually be for 2019. Some of the rule changes are related to whether or not those portfolio content category 3 and PCC2 RECs count as not having emissions. Previously, they showed up as zero emission energy. That's no longer the case. But the biggest change that's happened is related to asset controlling supplier power. This ACS type of power is supplied from a bunch of different generators in the Pacific Northwest, and it was previously reported as undisclosed but had a low emissions factor. Unfortunately, starting now for last year, where we have to report it as being related to the individual resource types that make up the energy group, if you will. And so it's mostly large hydroelectric energy from the Pacific Northwest, but there's a little bit of natural gas, a little bit of wind, and a little bit of nuclear energy that was generated that is associated with this. I think that's everything I wanted to touch on this slide.
Marie,
Yes.
Nick, I just want to add one point there. Do you want to go back about, yeah, thank you, on the new slides, about that ACS question. So, you know, these new rules have been under development at the California Energy Commission for almost, you know, more than a year. And, you know, there's been considerable uncertainty about the application of these rules. The regulations that required this change in reporting for ACS came into effect initially or became public in September and only went into effect this past May. The challenge for us is that they are applying the regulations retroactively. So in our case, we have procured ACS under one set of reporting rules, and under those reporting rules, we ourselves did not actually have the specific breakdown of resources. We knew it was unspecified, and we had an emissions factor. This disaggregation is now occurring. Oh, Marie, your Slack is up. Marie, your Slack is up. This reaggregation or disaggregation is now occurring, and, you know, yes, as a result, there is a very small amount of nuclear in particular that is now required to be reported, and will be required to be reported on a going forward basis to the degree that any CCA or any load serving entity for that matter has ACS in their portfolio. I think one of the important sort of points to make here, though, and, you know, it's very much different than say the matters we dealt with around Diablo Canyon. Diablo Canyon is a specified source of nuclear energy, whereas asset controlled supply is from a system. So, you know, in the way that we're buying, say, power from Bonneville, and there's different kinds of energy in that mix. Similarly, if Bonneville were to buy California CAISO power, well, they're not buying from nuclear per se, they're buying from California, and there happens to be some nuclear in California. So they're going to have that kind of, you know, pie chart of different resource types in their mix too. Now, they don't have the same reporting requirements, so that wouldn't necessarily be how their corollary to a power content label would look, but that's sort of that's where we are, one, and you know, that's, I think, the important difference between ACS and the fact that it has a little bit of nuclear in, say, Diablo Canyon.
Thanks, Nick. You also just did a really nice job of summarizing the next slide for me, so thank you. And yeah, that really, oh, absolutely, Mike.
Mike has a question. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you go back to the slide that showed the breakdown in the various groups? Yes, that one. Now, did I understand you correctly, Marie, that, for example, in the Renewable 100, where our customer is expecting to receive 100% of their energy through renewable sources, we can't specifically guarantee that that's going to occur. We're going to buy enough renewable energy to serve all those customers that want Renewable 100, but the actual energy that a customer may receive may not in its entirety be 100% renewable. Is that what I understood?
That is correct. At a very high
And
level,
there's no way that we can really break that down.
that's correct. Energy flows along the path of least resistance. And so, you know, if you live next door to Diablo Canyon, you're only getting nuclear energy, even if you're paying for 100% solar. Unless you put solar on your roof, then you're getting solar energy when it's sunny outside. If you live next door to a gas plant, you're getting a lot of energy from a gas plant. The actual energy, each electron that reaches customers is a mix of what is generated and on the system at a point in time. And because it's flowing along the path of least resistance, it's going to go to the sink, or where the demand source that's closest to it.
Do our customers have concern about that, or do they understand that that's the way energy kind of flows? And as long as we're meeting kind of the needs of the customer base that wants 100% renewable and we're meeting that goal, they're comfortable with that?
I don't think that it's a pretty weedy topic. And so I don't think that the average member of the public understands the nature of how energy flows over.
Mike,
over
what I would say is we have had, some conversations with customers, certain, I would say sort of large, very sophisticated energy users about more matching of zero carbon and load. One of the challenge, that can work actually somewhat well in the context of, say, like a data center that has a very steady usage pattern. So it's highly predictable. So, okay, I know every day it's going to be, no more different than, 5% up or down. So there have been some of those conversations, but I would say really no customers have raised this as a specific issue, apart from a couple of those large customers who are looking at these kinds of structured products around the country.
Thank you. And I did have the question on unspecified sources of power as it related to nuclear, and I appreciated your answer on that, Nick. You answered it. Appreciate it.
I just would add that this is one of the reasons that we value trying to invest in renewable resources in Alameda County, because that energy is then more likely to serve our customers, and it keeps the air for our customers cleaner. Any other questions on power content label?
On that topic, Marie, just to make sure the board is aware, previously we had put forth an item to the board that sort of talked about the emissions benchmarking that we would do on an annual basis to ensure that we're meeting the sort of power content targets that we have established and approved by the board. And that emissions benchmarking was premised off of the the then power content label rules. With these pretty substantive rule changes, we'll have to reevaluate, how that benchmarking exercise works, come back to the board and probably have some level of discussion. At that point in time, I think when we had gotten that approval for this particular, carbon emissions accounting methodology, we always knew, methodologies change and, things were on the horizon. So, we're not shocked by the fact that there is change in of itself. And so we'll raise it and bring it forth as a more formal item.
Thanks, Howard. Just real quickly, we do our emissions reporting currently through using a system called the Climate Registry, and it's whereas power content label is the percentage of energy that has come from different sources, this is associating pounds of carbon per megawatt. Well, in this case, it's per megawatt hour. And so this basic logic around like what's the weight of the emissions, this will come up again when we talk about the integrated resource planning and how we're trying to hit a certain number of metric tons of carbon emissions over time, and actually trying to lower the tonnage of of greenhouse gas emissions associated with our generation. But on this particular table, it's showing our emissions rates by our different customer types, and it's not a total number, it's measured in terms of pounds of carbon emissions per megawatt hour of energy. Okay, section 3. I was going to suggest a quick break. I do want to sort of flag that we're running a little bit behind schedule. Tim will be joining us pretty soon. So if, depending upon how people feel, I can keep going and then we can do a break right before Tim joins us. But please feel free to let me know if you think a break right now is a good idea.
I'm okay if you keep going.
Okay, great. Okay, so how do we build a portfolio of resources that's primarily renewable portfolio? So here's an example of one of the slides that I referenced that would show a scenario of demand and open position versus renewable generation. This is a hypothetical future date. The values represent the forecast demand in the blue line is a real forecast line because it's 5 years out in the future. I promise it will change between the actual forecast will change between now and then whatever the actual demand is will also change. The representations of generating resources in our portfolio are made up examples. This is not real. But for the next few slides, I am going to be showing different, basically different representations of if we had this portfolio of resources, a certain amount of solar, a certain amount of wind, and a certain amount of geothermal, what would we forecast the generation to look like in relation to our demand? So in this specific date, in this specific case, it's a January day. The gray bars represent, the gray bars represent solar, the orange represents wind, and the yellow represents geothermal. What I want to point out is that in the middle of the day, we would forecast to have more demand, or excuse me, more generation from solar than we have demand. But at the beginning of the day, we are really short. And at the end of the day, we're really short. If we had the exact same portfolio using another day in July, here's our blue demand line, and we have so much over generation in the middle of the day. But again, we're significantly short in the morning and we're significantly short in the end of the day. I think these slides do a good job of demonstrating why we don't just want to execute contracts with solar resources and the value of having different types of generating resources in our portfolio. And the value, and pretty soon we'll talk about the value of different types of transactions in our portfolio as well. So when we're thinking about building a portfolio of resources, the first thing we do is assess our needs. If we already had these resources in our portfolio, the needs that I would be trying to address, it would have to do with our demand forecast for energy. So what's our peak demand on a monthly basis, and what's the average demand on a monthly basis? Do our load shapes every month tend to look like these? We'd also look at what are our compliance requirements, what do we have to do in terms of RPS and resource adequacy? What are our other EBCE goals? Like, we know we don't want nuclear energy. We know that our customers don't really want energy coming from natural gas resources. So, maybe we can get some system power, but procuring from a natural gas resource is tricky. What are the market dynamics? It can be okay to have some open position and exposure to the energy market prices at times, but this level of exposure, that's too risky. That's rolling the dice and hoping that things work out for us, and it would not be financially prudent. And then we think about risk management and what strategies we can employ to hedge or close off some of these open positions. We also think about, when it comes to long-term contracts, are our contracts going to be financeable? Because we're a young organization and we don't have a credit rating, we just have to be aware of that and make sure that we're entering into transactions that we think will actually be able to get financed and thus built. So these are all of the needs that we're trying to solve for. The next step is to think about prioritizing those needs and developing a method for valuing the attributes that different generating resources or commercial structures bring to us. So in terms of prioritization, compliance is number one, because it's something that we have to do or we get penalized. It's demonstrating that we're a good participant in the market and in the state, and it's certainly in line with all of our organizational goals. So compliance comes first. Market dynamics, managing our open position and mitigating or managing our exposure to market prices comes second. If we don't pay attention to this category, we set ourselves up basically for an energy crisis type of situation where we hope that there's enough generation available to serve our demand, but we have no certainty of it. And we don't want that to happen. So, if we make a mistake here, we could go bankrupt. And, we can't hit our organizational goals if we cease to exist. So paying attention to market dynamics and putting in place good risk management and hedging strategies are important so that we can also prioritize our organizational goals. On the valuation side of things, we value resources and commercial structures using quantitative and qualitative factors. So some examples of quantitative factors, we look at what do we think the future value of different things will be? What do we estimate the future value of energy in the energy market will be? What do we think the future value of resource adequacy that's traded in its own marketplace will be? What do we think the value of RECs will be? We also look at the estimated value of different locations, thinking back to the graph with the P nodes, and on the qualitative side, we think about what's desirable in terms of having some open position. We think about counterparty credit terms and creditworthiness. In the interest of time, I'm just going to talk about environmental considerations. The Power Resources team is in the process of putting together some guidelines that we can use to essentially to evaluate how does a resource contribute to environmental stewardship. Yes, a wind farm or solar farm is a good thing. It's renewable energy. But a solar farm built where a natural gas plant once was is a home run from an environmental stewardship perspective. It's brownfield development. It's eliminating the natural gas emissions. A solar farm that's built in endangered species territory that eliminates tiger salamander habitat, that is not such a home run from an environmental perspective. We get renewable energy, but we kill a bunch of endangered species. We don't really want to do that. That's not in keeping with our values. So we're trying to develop a framework that will help us look at resources and weigh environmental stewardship from a qualitative perspective. So that's prioritization and valuation. Third, we define what products can meet our needs. So, we have over generation in the middle of the day, insufficient generation in the morning and in the evening. In this table, I've listed a bunch of different product types. Renewable generation, that's the example of one of our renewable energy contracts. But is it shaped or dispatchable? Like, for example, a biogas resource. A biogas resource is basically a gas power plant that uses methane that has been collected, burns methane that has been collected. That's actually a dispatchable resource. so it counts as renewable. It might have some resource adequacy value, and in this example, it would help us hedge our energy position because we could instruct it to turn on in this open window of time. A traditional wind farm or solar farm would not meet this yes, shaped and dispatchable designation. Let's see, an energy storage toll. This term toll means it's a tolling contract is a contract structure that is most typically used associated with natural gas plants, but what it's doing is thinking about what is the ability of the resource to be dispatchable, to take in fuel and be dispatchable when it is actually directed to do so. So an energy storage contract that is dispatchable under our direction is, no, it's not a renewable contract, but it would have resource adequacy value, and we would be able to use it to hedge. We could instruct it, we want you to charge in the middle of the day here and then discharge over here. So what I want to demonstrate in this slide is just that there are a lot of different products, and maybe none of them meet all of our needs, but if we put a mix of them together, we can close off our total needs by mixing and matching. Are there any questions about this before I move on to the next slide?
I have a question, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Mike.
Mr. President. When you talk about energy sources, risk management, when you talk about risk management, and we look at our energy sources, whether it be wind farm or solar farm, things of that nature, where we have contracted out to purchase energy over a period of time, if there should be a natural disaster, an earthquake, a fire, or something of that nature that destroys that energy source, do we have kind of backup plans built into place to secure energy elsewhere? What are our plans in that regard? Thank you.
Yes. So if there was an earthquake that totally destroyed like a wind farm or a solar farm, there are provisions in contracts that would allow us to effectively terminate the contract. So, you know, we might have to wait a period of time to see if it can be rebuilt. But, you know, in the case of an earthquake that basically swallows up a portion of the earth, that thing is not being rebuilt anytime. So we can effectively assume we're terminating that contract, and we will go to market and we will look to replace it with additional resources. Hold on just 1 second, I'm gonna cough. Excuse me. We look at our ability to meet our compliance obligations, but we don't get down to the level of planning where we're thinking about what if there's an earthquake, or what if there's some sort of act of God that takes out a portion of our energy supply. That's where we really lean on the fact that we're part of the CAISO market, and you know, if we closed our position so that there was only a little bit of demand that was not met by our own supply, and then there was an earthquake that wiped out a few resources, well, then we would have to buy more generation through the energy market in the very short term, or we could go to market, or we could go out and try to transact for this first product, the fixed price energy hedge. And that's basically calling a counterparty. That it could be a natural gas plant, or it could be a counterparty that owns a bunch of different generating resources, and say to them, we'd like to buy energy from you on a certain schedule where you deliver us like 100 megawatts of energy in every hour of the day. So we do have the ability to enter into other types of transactions with market participants that are not fully contracted under a long-term contract with an entity like us. But that's really, this is the benefit of being part of an organized system and not having to do all of the risk management ourselves.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, let's move on. Thank you.
So after we've defined the eligible products, we identified our needs, we prioritized our needs and thought about how we were going to value the contributions of resources, identified products that were eligible to meet our needs, then we go to market. And so we put together materials that identify what products we want, what timeline we want these resources to come online and start delivering energy to us. We notify market participants, developers of renewable energy projects, or people who own a fleet of generating resources, and we tell them, this is what we're looking for. We want you to make us an offer. We ask them to make offers, receive those offers, then we do the evaluation of the offers using the quantitative and qualitative measures that I laid out before. In the case of a long-term contract, we negotiate the contracts. That's very important. Then we calculate the final proposed notional values of these contracts. And then for anything long-term, we ask for your permission before we enter into it. And then we actually execute an agreement. I want to make one note about this term, proposed notional values. It's a bit of a misnomer. When I'm talking about a notional value here, I'm really talking about what is the cost to EBCE of the contract for the life of the contract. It's not a true measure of value, because this is just a chance to look at how much do we think we're going to be paying out on this contract over its 5, 10, 15, 20-year lifetime. The true value is how much are we going to pay out, but also how much revenue do we think we're going to get from for the generation through the energy market. That's the true value. But when I say I just wanted to call out, when I say notional value, it's really how much do we think this thing is going to cost us. Okay, so that is an overview of how do we build an RPS portfolio and what are the factors that we're taking into consideration. Section 4, this is the section that Tim Belden will be speaking to. So we've done a pretty good job of getting close to back on schedule. I'd like to suggest that we take a 5-minute break here. And I will check and see if Tim is online, but let's see, it's 5:40, so maybe we can all come back at 5:45 and keep going through the slides.
Okay, this is everybody's opportunity to take a little break, and we'll be back in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Marie and Howard, this is Tim. Can you guys hear me?
And does everyone see the slide that says discussion of solar risk again?
Yep.
Great. All right. Let's see. It looks, maybe we'll give it just one more moment. It looks like people are returning. So I want to take a moment and introduce Tim Belden. Tim is the founder of an organization called Energy GPS. He is an expert in energy markets, and he's a consultant that we work with, and whose advice and counsel we seek, especially on challenging issues like the risks associated with having a lot of solar generation in an energy market. And Tim, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, sure. Hey, thanks for having me. Again, is my sound coming through okay? Okay, great.
I think you sound great.
Cool. So yeah, my name is Tim Belden. I'm with a relatively small firm. We're about 15 people. We're called Energy GPS. We're located in Portland, Oregon. I'm a wholesale electricity expert, geek, whatever phrase you'd like to use. Spent a lot of time looking at the intersection of wholesale markets and renewables. And I spent a lot of time recently looking at the interplay between solar and batteries, solar solar and solar plus storage and batteries by themselves. Marie, props to you for a really clear discussion so far. I do a lot of these trainings and a lot of these discussions, and your presentation was really clear and crisp. I took a bunch of notes during it, so thanks for that. I'm going to introduce a bunch of concepts and terminology for you. I'm going to try to define it as we go. Some of this much of it could be new. Hopefully, much of it is also understandable. I've tried to make as many notes in the deck as I could so that you could either reference it as we go or reference it later, should you wish to. So I think let's just dive into it. And I'll take questions as we go. Howard, feel free to pause me or amplify a point if the translation, if you think there's a better way to translate it. Because that's what a lot of this exercise is translating it from technical wholesale market speak to speak that more generalists could understand. So what's it all about? I'll start with some technical babble. Solar penetration rates, shape ratios, price dispersion. These are the terms and the tools that we use to think about price risk and solar risk in particular. On the right is the graph that I think everybody's probably seen, which is the infamous duck curve, which is just showing that it could be a graph of price. It actually happens to be a graph of net load, which Howard described earlier, which is simply California load minus solar production. And so as the solar production increases, it's going to impact the supply of solar during certain hours, and therefore the pricing of during certain hours, and therefore the value of solar during certain hours. So next slide, please. So ECBE, so this is just a representation of East Bay is the portfolio manager there in the middle. Simplified source of wind, and the image above the wind box is a 24-hour average wind production in California in 2019. So it produces overnight, down a little bit in the middle of the day, up in the afternoon. And every single day it's going to be different. And then you're going to have some solar. And that's your average solar production during 2019. Again, CAISO wide. And then I borrowed the Tetris image because that's what your job is, right? You've got to take this load, which is in the bottom right, these various supplies, which are intermittent, produce different amounts on different days, different hours, and different months. And then your job is to fill in the blocks so that your supply meets your demand. So here's the thesis. There's a mismatch between solar or wind production and the load that you have to serve. The net cost of your market purchases, those Tetris blocks that you either need to buy to meet your load, or some of those Tetris blocks you're going to be selling when you've got excess. The difference between what you're buying in the form of wind and solar and what you have to sell that excess for, and what you're buying to serve your load in the East Bay, that's the risk, is that the price of those things are different. And one of the analogies that I thought about, actually, Maria, as you were talking about, is imagine your obligation is to deliver a 100 level seat to a Warriors game. That's your obligation. But you can't always buy that 100 level seat 6 months, 12 months, 3 years in advance. And so you buy some 300 level seats, you buy some 200 level seats, then you hope during the day of the game that you'll be able to sell that 300 level seat and buy a 100 level seat to meet your obligation, or sell that 200 level seat and buy that 100 level seat to meet that obligation. And depending on the day, the difference between those ticket prices could be a little or a lot. For a big playoff game, the $100 seat or the 100 level seats can be really valuable. On a bad weather day in January against a poor team, it's not going to be as much. And so really it's talking about your obligation is load in the East Bay, and your supply comes in different shapes and in different locations. So there's a bunch of mismatches. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to run through this now, but I just wanted to, you're going to see this repeating slide of definitions, and I'm going to define things as we go, but I just wanted to put this in here as a complete list of the definitions that I'm going to talk through. Reference it later. Next slide, please. All right, so shape. You own this solar shape. In fact, I poached these slides from Marie's deck. So you own this portfolio that this slide happens to show a bunch of, it's predominantly solar. And your load has a bunch of gaps in it, right? There's a bunch of times where your supply does not meet your load. And so your risk is that the stuff that you bought is low value, and the stuff that you still need to buy is high cost. And that's your risk. And how will that relationship change over time? Next slide. Another view of it, just a different month. Again, very much solar dominated. Now you own excess solar, so your risk is that the excess solar that you need to sell is going to be low value. And again, you still have some shortages. You're actually energy long here, right? The total volume of energy that you bought exceeds the volume of energy that you're obligated to deliver. It just happens to come at a different time of day. So again, the risk is that the solar is low value and that the shortage intervals are high cost. Next slide. Okay, so now we're just going to kind of walk through some of the definitions. What is your weighted average solar versus simple average price for NP15? So for 2019, if I take the hour by hour, I take the solar production in California as a whole, I multiply that by the NP15, which is the regional hub price of the market that you sit in. The solar weighted price for 2019 was $26. That's what that solar shape was worth up top. The simple average price across, so I've just got, oh, I'm sorry, I should have set up the axis here. You've got hours on the x-axis and price on the y-axis for the bottom graph, and you've got hours on the x-axis and volume of solar on the y-axis for the top graph. And so the bottom graph shows the hourly prices, and those come out to average $35.30 for the year. And then when you take those hourly prices on the bottom graph and you weight them by the volumes on the top graph, it comes out to 26 bucks. So that's what I call the solar weighted price is 26. Next slide. And so now I'm just graphing the bottom image. The bottom line shows the solar weighted price from 2016 through 2019. And the top line shows the simple average price for NP15, Northern California, from 2016 through 2019. So what's the message here? The solar weighted price has stayed about the same, $25, $26. And the simple average price has gone up from $28.72 up to $35.90 during that same time period. So the solar is not tracking the simple average. Next slide, please. So in order to make comparisons easier, we have this term that I call the solar shape ratio. And that's simply the ratio of those two lines. So you've got the solar weighted price is the numerator, the simple average price is the denominator. And on the bottom, so the top just shows those prices over time. The bottom shows the solar shape ratio, which is the ratio of those two prices. And you can see the solar shape ratio is 89% in 2016. In 2019, it was 73%. In 2020, year to date, it's 74%. So you're seeing the value of solar decline relative to the average price of electricity by year. Next slide. So here's your definition. Solar shape ratio. Solar weighted price divided by simple average price. Thank you. So so you guys don't own all of your demand is in NP15 in the PG&E service territory in the East Bay. All of your supply, some of it comes from NP15, some of it can come from elsewhere. It could come from SP15. And so the top image is the same as the previous slide. It's just showing the solar shape ratio for NP15 solar pricing versus NP15 simple average price. The bottom image shows SP15 solar weighted price over your simple average NP15. So what we see is that they track each other, but they're not the same. I'm going to circle back to this concept in a minute, but next slide, please. So now we talked about solar weighted is the image on the left. The image on the right, instead of solar, I'm now weighting by your demand. And in this case, this is CAISO overall demand. I didn't do the East Bay demand specifically. So the next few images, or all the images in here, are weighted by CAISO demand, not your specific demand. But what happens when you take so the image on the right, the top is volume and the bottom is that same price graph. So you still have a $35.30 simple average, but the volume weighted or the demand weighted price for 2019 was $37.26. So demand was higher than the demand weighted price was higher than the simple average. Next slide. So now again, you'll find I like to do division, create ratios. And so here is the top is the volume weighted load LMP and your simple average LMP, and the bottom is the ratio of those two. And so you can see it's been right around 104, 105%, except for in 2017, it kicked up to 109%. I didn't research why that was. But you can see, with the exception of 2017, the demand weighted price was just a slight premium above the simple average price. Next slide. So I call that load shape ratio. So load weighted price over simple average price. Exact same common concept as the solar shape ratio, just different weighting, using different volumes to weight it. Next slide. So one of the ways that you can measure solar risk is you say, okay, my obligation is this 104% of the simple average price. My obligation is what it's going to cost me to buy energy in my load zone to serve my load. And that's going to be just a little bit over 100% of the simple average price. But the thing that I've bought to serve my load is this solar shape, and that's going down in value. And so to use the ticket analogy, I'm obligated for this 100 level ticket, this prime seat at the Warriors game, and this 300 level seat that I bought in order to hedge myself, although it's not a perfect hedge, might go down in value over time. And so the gap between those two, or the variability of that gap between those two, is the risk that you face, the financial risk that you face, that what you bought becomes worth less relative to your sales obligations. I'm going to take a pause in about 2 more slides for questions. So if there's questions, I'll take a pause in a couple of slides. So next slide, please. So same story, but this time, the bottom one, instead of being the NP15 solar shape ratio, it's the SP15 solar shape ratio, and that looks a little bit different. Finally, the next slide. So now you compare, so now this slide is just combining the 2 previous slides. The top is still the load shape ratio. The bottom now has the NP15 solar shape ratio, which is the darker color, the SP15 solar shape ratio, the lighter color. So a couple of themes. NP15 solar typically worth more, right? In 2016, 2017, 2019, and 2020, it's been worth more. In 2018, the NP15 solar shape was worth less. The reason for that is the Aliso Canyon constraints. Natural gas storage facilities in Southern California caused really high gas prices in Southern California. The clearing prices at the SP15 Southern California hub rose well above the clearing prices at the Northern California hub. So somebody who owned solar in SP15 in 2018 got kind of lucky that, just financially lucky, that the high gas prices caused by the Aliso Canyon storage constraints benefited the solar shape in SP15. Those constraints have been resolved some and haven't shown up nearly as much in the years since. And so we've gone back to the SP15 is a discount to NP15. This is a pretty good time for a pause. Howard, if you want to elaborate on anything or take any questions on the information so far.
I think you did a good job of hitting the point, so I don't have much to elaborate on. You know, the only point I would make is when we think about risk management for our entity and, you know, what we have to do to evaluate projects, this is the type of issue that we're really trying to understand, right? Is this variability of the gap between our project value and, you know, what we need to hedge, which is really this load shape curve that on the top. And over a 15, 20, or 25-year period, you know, the gap here is very unpredictable. And so that's the difficult part of our roles and what we need to bring forth to the board for approval.
Thank you. Any questions? Mike, you have a question?
Yeah, just for my own clarification, the thought that comes to my mind, Tim, is kind of income averaging. Does that kind of play a sense as to how we purchase this solar energy, that on any given day, because the prices are going to fluctuate up and down, that we try to not look at it on a short-term basis, but more on a long-term basis, so that even though we may be paying less today or more today, we hope that over a period of time that the pricing in and of itself is somewhat constant?
Well, so I think I would say, I would use the term, and I think Howard mentioned it earlier, and I think Bree mentioned it earlier, and I thought Marie's slide that showed, you know, does it provide a RA, does it provide a REC, does it provide energy? I think it's about finding not income averaging, but portfolio balancing. So we're looking at one resource, which is solar, and that has a particular set of risks. And the risk is that as more solar goes onto the grid, the value of solar is almost certainly going to decline.
Mike,
should you obsess about that every day and every hour? Probably not. But if you think that it's going to go back from 70% up to 90% value, that would not be a good assumption. So I'm not sure if I addressed the income averaging.
Mike, this is Nick. I want to give you kind of another analogy to the income averaging, and that has somewhat to do with, you see NP15 versus SP15 solar shape, and then earlier we had sort of this concept of LMP nodes. One of the reasons why we want geographic diversity of our projects is to get that income averaging of CAISO revenues, right? So it's actually one of the reasons why you don't want to put all your projects, say, in Alameda County, because you have that gives you a really significant concentration risk at a single pricing node. You're not income averaging in that. But if you say, we're going to do some in northern, some in southern, some in the middle, some in the east, some in the west, that gives you kind of an income average, recognizing that there are different costs and characteristics of projects in different areas. But it's an argument for that kind of diversity in your portfolio as well.
Thanks, Nick. I appreciate it.
Okay, let's move on. Thank you.
Okay, so this slide is just intended to give you a little bit more flavor of the solar, of what's happening to solar value in California. The top image shows every day of the year, and it's a running total of solar curtailments in the CAISO. So you've got essentially 365 days on the x-axis, and then volume of solar curtailment on the y-axis. And so in 2019, the middle line there, the solar curtailment was right around 1 million megawatt hours for the entire year. In 2020, just year to date, the CAISO is already at 1.2 million. So you've had more than all of last year's curtailment happen in the first 6 months of 2020. Now, most of the curtailment does happen in the first 6 months because it's especially in Q2, but you're seeing a lot more solar curtailment. The bottom one, work with me on this because it's worth it. I've segmented, so I've taken all of the prices in a year, and I've binned them into these different colors. One bin is greater than $100 a megawatt hour, and this is for NP15, the real-time market. The next bin is 60 to 100. The next bin is 20 to 60. I've got 0 to 20, and I've got negative. And so let's start in 2014. The yellow and the red are negative and 0 to 20. So 79% of, almost 80% of the prices in NP15, and this is only during the middle of the day, during the solar hours of the day. Almost 80% of the prices were what I would call normal prices, $20 to $60. And that's essentially the price that happens in normal supply demand conditions when natural gas is the resource that's setting price in California. So almost 80% of the hours, you had what I'm calling normal pricing, that red-green color line, but I think it's an aqua green there in the middle. Very few low prices and just a handful of really high prices. Now fast forward to 2020, and this is only January through June because I wanted to get 2020 on a comparable basis. You now have 2/3 of your prices in January through June, 12% plus 57%, are either negative or below $20 a megawatt hour. Your normal pricing has shrunk from 79% down to 29%. And your price spikes, let's call it 60 to 100 or the greater than 100, are essentially gone. And so solar has really shifted the pricing dynamic of NP15 from 2014 to present. And we've seen a pretty big shift. Like you look at 2016 through 2019, and those numbers are all pretty comparable, right? 37, 39, 36, 37 in terms of the normal pricing, and now you've squeezed it even more in 2020. So just evidence that solar is really having a really big impact on the middle of the day pricing in the CAISO.
And maybe just layer on one more tidbit. You know, I think we currently have something like 12 gigawatts of capacity of solar in CAISO. I don't know what the number was in 2014, but certainly a fraction of that.
Yeah, 2, something like that.
Yeah, and so and I think we have projections going in the future of 2x, 3x that number if we're going to hit that SB 100 goal. And so it's very difficult to project the trends over the next 10, 20 years, but you can see over the last 6, it's had a very dramatic pricing impact.
Yep. I'm looking at the time check here, and I think I've been going for about 20 minutes now. What do you want to do? What's my target time? 30?
Yeah, I think we're okay going another 20 minutes or so. There's no scheduled stop here, but I think people's brain tend to be fried after 2.5, maxing at 3 hours. So we want to be totally done, definitely in under 3 hours. And I think the last section we have here is a little bit on the shorter end. So definitely, I think another 20 minutes or so would be good.
Okay, great. Next slide, please. I'll make this part. There's one punchline here. So the solar shape ratio, which is the top graph shows the wind shape ratio and the solar shape ratio on the same slide. I'm just going to talk to the top part of the image. The wind shape ratio has been very steady over time. So wind has held its value. And so wind shape ratio is the volume weighted price of wind in the numerator and the NP15 price in the denominator. So the wind shape ratio was 97% in 2014, and it's 95% year to date. And it's gone down, it's gone up, but it's pretty much held its own. While the solar shape ratio has declined from 91% in 2014 down to 76%. This is a 12-month rolling average, so it doesn't perfectly tie out to the previous numbers, but the theme here is that wind is holding its value, solar is declining in value. And that's because there's a lot less wind in the CAISO. And again, if you think about getting a portfolio of resources and diversifying your risk, wind is likely more expensive and higher implied REC value than solar, but a little bit of wind in your portfolio mitigates some of the shape value risk. Next slide. Again, just some, I've just defined wind shape ratio there. Let's keep rolling. Just hit this one briefly. Marie already covered it, but it's going to get more and more. I think as Howard said, we're going to get more and more renewables. So the pressure on the middle of the day pricing is going to be more and more. And you have to be increasingly thoughtful about how you build your portfolio to deal with that. Next slide. So this is the results of, it's illustrative results of some analysis that I've done recently. So one of the things I do is I help people calculate out, project out the value of the resource that they're going to buy, the value of the load that they have to serve. This is approximately right. This is approximately kind of where the market is for these different pieces. So let me just talk you through it. So the forward market, Howard, forward market, do you want to, have you talked about that? Do you want to describe what that is?
Spend a second on it, but I think most folks have a grasp of that definition.
Okay. So forward market is just, if I were to today to buy just energy in NP15 and go to the market and say, hey, how much would it cost me to buy energy in NP15 around the clock or block for all hours of the day? For the 2021 through 2035 time period, it would cost me about 36 bucks. That's the 35.95 in the under the 2021 to 2035. And the way that looks by year, you can see in 2021 it's 37. It goes down to 33.93 in 2025, and then goes back up later on. And now I'm taking the second row. Is just I'm saying let's assume that your NP15 load shape value, that 104% number is the right number going out into the future. I haven't done a study to say whether that's the right number, but let's just use that as a placeholder. The next row says, what do we think the solar shape value is going to do over time? We know that historically it went from 91% down to 70 some odd percent. If you go to the market believes that the solar shape value is going to be about 58% between 2021 and 2035. So they think it'll be 72% roughly, and low 70s in 2021, and they think by 2035 the solar shape value could be as low as 38%. And when you take the average of that over that time period, you get that 58% is the expected future solar shape value. So now we just do a little math, and we take the NP15 price of all hours and multiply it by 104%. So that's your NP15 load value. And then you take the NP15 price all hours, multiply it by the solar shape value, and that gets you your NP15 solar value. And so the yellow line is the spread, the delta, the difference between what, according to the current forward market and these current projections for the various shape values, that's the spread between the value of what you might own if you owned NP15 solar and the cost of serving your load in the East Bay. And so that was roughly $11, that $11.14 in 2019. Over the 2021 to 2035 time period, it's $16.61, $16.17, and 2035 that differential is $26.58. And so this is just showing steady degradation in the value of solar over time, and that spread between the cost at your load and the value of your generation increasing over time. Let me hit pause here because we're about to shift into battery land, and this I think is the culmination of all those ratios, kind of turn them back into dollars per megawatt hour so that you can see what could happen to your portfolio if this played out to be true. And I would consider this a very realistic forward case.
Let me highlight a few things too, maybe just to help emphasize a couple points. One is, as you look at general energy prices between 2021 and 2035, you see with the NP15 load, $39 in 2021 to $42 in 2035. It's a general upward, trend or forecast of our energy prices. Now, somewhat speculative, really hard to predict where prices will be over the course of the next 15 years. But that's the sort of general market view is energy prices are going to increase a bit. And then when you look at the NP15 solar value, it's going from $27 in 2021 to $15 in 2035. So the general view on solar is with increased solar penetration, the value has to go down. And the third point I would just add on this page is when you think about where we see solar projects today, I won't go into sort of confidential information for what we've signed, but the general range of where long-term, sort of new solar projects are getting built around now is between the $20 to $25 range. And so if you just do that comparison of where the solar value is 27 going down to 15, a new project right now is probably generally in the money by a few dollars. And the expectation is that going out 5, 10, 15 years from now, it's going to be out of the money. You're going to be losing money on that hedge just from a pure financial basis. And so that's a lot of what needs to go into the analysis of how much do you really want to go and procure solar. We absolutely have to go buy more renewables. The predominant form of that is solar. How do you manage that risk? And certainly we'll segue into some of those points of how you manage that risk next with storage, but that's a big fundamental concern that we have as we go out and procure hundreds of megawatts of energy, mostly in the form of solar.
So I know I had a quick question. If
Go ahead.
Chair?
Yeah, go ahead.
Given that what you're saying is starting in 2020, I think, I can't remember if it's 2020, 2021, EBC is going to be required to actually have 10-year contracts for renewable portfolio standard. And this is, there seems to be a very large jump in 5-year period between 2030 and 2035. Well, I know it's very hard to suggest what exactly is going to happen with that. Would you say that it's a straight line between 2030 and 2035? Because it certainly didn't seem to be between 2025 and 2030. And so when I think of the long-term contracts for solar that EBCE may need to or want to put in place, does it mean, like, given this, our risks will be greater if we sign them after 2025, after 2023, something like that? Does that make sense?
I think it does. I'll take a shot at answering that. I mean, I think there's a couple factors there. One I'll say is just from a compliance standpoint, we have to put in contracts in place now over the next 4-year period to get roughly 2/3 of our renewable energy procurement for long-term contracts. So from a compliance perspective, you can't really wait till 2025 to do that. We have to do at least a pretty significant share of those contracts. If we didn't have that compliance requirement, I think there are questions to say, how do you stagger your contracts? One, to just sort of diversify that risk in sort of time. And is it beneficial to wait some amount of time because for some reason there may be a market view to say, hey, it's going to be better in 5 years. I think that the forecasts are, they're somewhat speculative, but, I think those are things that we have to ask ourselves are there going to be continued cost declines in solar as well as in storage, and you should wait in order to do that? Are there benefits to doing more procurements over the course of the next few years because the ITC tax incentive is still in place? And so you in fact will get a better price now than in 5 years. So those are open questions and certainly part of what we have to think about in terms of timing of procurement.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask that question a little differently? So, 20 years ago, the peak demand time was, noon to 6 p.m., especially in the summer. That was the time that energy demand was highest, energy costs were highest. And so it made a lot of sense to put a lot of new solar onto the grid because that's when solar produces. So you're adding supply when the demand and the costs are highest. That's no longer true going forward. Looks like it's unlikely to ever be true again, at least in the foreseeable future. And so I'm sitting here thinking, well, then maybe we just should stop buying solar, period. and invest in other renewables. Wind, for example, which produces in the middle of the night, which is where we've shown the biggest gap in our own supply versus demand. So isn't that the obvious and you know, the only takeaway or the only major takeaway to reach, or am I missing something?
I think part of the challenge is available capacity of wind in California. There's not nearly as much available capacity for new wind than there is for solar. So we're simply limited in how much we can do. You know, in all of these ratios and graphs that Tim has shown, it doesn't necessarily incorporate what is the actual market price for signing these new projects up today, right? And so I referenced the price point for solar, you know, ballpark relative to this curve. You know, we could do the similar analysis for wind. Wind has stayed more consistent. Part of the reason wind has stayed more consistent is because there hasn't been nearly as much wind built out, because you can't do it. You can't do too much more of that. There's just not that much good, high quality wind resource out there. And what is out there, you know, is just not as efficient, and therefore you are seeing higher PPA prices. So when you start looking at those aspects.
So sorry to interrupt, but I'm assuming then the same is true in terms of the available capacity for geothermal and small hydro. It's not like we're going to go out and build a bunch of new dams in California. So like the only new renewable we can build is solar, but we don't need more solar. Am I basically understanding
That
this
is
correctly?
absolutely, that is the challenge. Right. Yeah. As you look at
so let's talk about batteries then.
Yes.
There's a lot of 300 level tickets available, right? Everybody's got the 300 level tickets, and you need some 100 level tickets.
I'm sorry, this is Councilmember Call, Chair. I'm going to have to step off now, unfortunately, with another meeting. So Diane, Councilmember Martinez will chair the rest of the retreat. Thank you so much to the staff and the consultant for putting this together. This is very helpful. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, if we could get back to the presentation to keep everything moving, that'd be great.
Okay, so now we're shifting into batteries. So this image is trying to walk you through the relationship between battery value and solar shape value. So imagine the x-axis here is a typical day where you've got hours 1 through 24 on the x-axis, and you've got hourly prices on the y-axis. And so it's expensive overnight, it gets really cheap during the maximum solar hours, it gets super expensive around hour ending 20 when the sun goes down. And so what a battery does is it buys those cheap hours that I've circled on the bottom, and it sells, and a 4-hour battery will buy 4 of those circles. And then it'll sell 4 of those prices during the most expensive hours. And so just illustratively, I've said, okay, the average sales price is $45. It's the average of those high circled prices, high prices that I've circled, just illustratively. It's going to buy for 15, and its margin for that day is going to be $30 a megawatt hour. 45 minus 15 gives you $30 a megawatt hour. So that's going to be your battery margin for that day. Next slide, please. So battery margin, just average sales price less average purchase price. Next slide. So again, this one's a little busy, work with me. So now imagine that we've got, on the bottom, I've got solar shape. So let's assume you've got a $40 around the clock price, and you've got a situation, I'm looking at the 70-10 situation here, 70 on the top dot, 10 on the bottom. So if you've got $40 power around the clock and the solar shape value is 40%, your solar value is going to be 16. If your solar shape is 50%, it's going to be 20. 60%, your solar value is going to be 24 megawatt hour. 70%, your solar shape is going to be 28. Now I've given really just, again, illustrative, but let's take the let's start at the 70% solar shape with $28 solar energy. Your your average purchase price for your battery will be about 20 bucks, and your average sale price will be about $60. And this is not too far from what happened in 2019. It's not exact, but it's again illustrative. And so then the question becomes, so in 2019, it would have made about $40. A 4-hour battery would have made about $40 a megawatt hour. And now, if you go to a 60% shape, it'll make about $50 a megawatt hour. And there's a question mark there because it's a modeling question. We're not sure exactly what that would be. But essentially, as your shape value goes down, as the value of the belly of the duct gets lower and lower, and the head of the duct gets higher and higher, your solar goes down in value, but your battery, that spread between your purchase and your sale, goes up. And so the key point here is that in the modeling I've done, it's an open question, but as the shape value goes down, the battery value goes up. And so those two are self-hedging, right? If you do a solar plus storage, the storage increases in value just as your solar is decreasing value. And so that's the purpose of this slide, is simply to illustrate that. Next slide. This is like your 400 level slide. I'm not expecting everybody to get this, but this is the sort of conversation that I would have with the procurement team if East Bay asked me, to help analyze things. But on the x-axis is the solar value, solar shape value. On the y-axis is your battery arbitrage. And pretend that's dollars per megawatt hour. I've got it as a ratio, but you can just assume that that's dollars per megawatt hour. And so you can see that solar value increases as the shape value increases, or decreases as the shape value decreases. And the big question mark is in 2017, 2018, and 2019 are all graphed on here. So those are the actual observed solar shape values for those years. And those are also showing the value of a 4-hour battery expressed in this metric that I use called dispersion. And the question that Howard and team are going to have to wrestle with in their procurement is, okay, it's 65% solar shape. What's my battery worth? At 55%, what's it worth? At 45%, what's it worth? And I've shown these 3 dots, the 65, 55, and 45, because that's the level where I think the battery is actually worth it in a bunch of modeling that we've done. I don't want to necessarily dive too deeply into this graph, but these are the questions that you're going to have to ask: is how much does the battery increase as the solar decreases? And in my view, your break even on your battery is right around these orange dots, which is essentially saying that the battery value in the future needs to be comparable. It's close on the y-axis as the battery value was in the past, and I think that's a reasonable assumption to make.
And I think too, one important point is, this doesn't incorporate the actual cost of the battery itself, correct? And so
this is the revenue story, correct?
Right, exactly. And so there's an even more complicating factor, which is you got to put a third axis on there and think about what is the actual cost of the battery that's in the market.
Yeah, I agree.
I think this slide is probably we're probably better served to go on to the wrap-up slides, because there's pretty.
Let's keep moving.
Issue, but we did want to include it.
All right, let's wrap up. So just, a couple of high points. You've got load shape, you've got shape risk, right? Load and solar have a different shape. So you're gonna have to be mindful of that. You're gonna have to take a view on that. Next slide. The shape risk is gonna get worse over time. I'm not going to repeat what I just said, but just, the gap is going to increase. It's been increasing. It's projected to get wider. Next slide. Battery is going to offset that risk. Got to do a bunch of math associated with that, but battery will increase in value as solar shape declines in value. Final slide is there's a lot of factors that you're going to have to take into consideration as you think about building your portfolio. Do you do it in NP15 or SP15, or a little bit of both? Do you do solar alone or solar plus storage, or a little bit of both? And You know, there's a lot of uncertainty in the future. This is a more uncertainty now than ever because of technology risk, because the grid is changing. And, you know, your procurement team is just going to have to do a lot of thoughtful analysis as you build your portfolio to meet your needs in the future. And that's a wrap.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. And I believe everyone's been asking great questions along the way. So does that bring it back to you, Marie?
Yes,
I have a question for him real quick. On the battery side, are you agnostic in terms of whether the battery is in front of the meter or aggregated behind the meter in terms of this analysis?
I'm not, depending on the use case, it will make more sense to put it in front or more sense behind. So I'm not agnostic, but there's circumstances where it makes sense behind the meter and certain circumstances where it makes sense in front of the meter.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry I missed you, Mary. Okay, Marie, take it away.
Okay, thanks very much. Tim, thank you very much. That was fascinating. And
thanks everyone.
I'm really
I'll be
grateful
dropping.
that you talked through that, not me. Okay, so now that we've gone through risks associated with having a lot of solar in our portfolio, let's wrap up by just talking about some of the other risks that EBCE is facing. When I talk about risk management, I'm mostly talking about how we manage the exposure of our demand and supply to the CAISO markets. I'm not talking as much about compliance risk, at least for the purposes of the next few slides. So the table on the right is an example. I'll talk through it in just a second. But right now, because we don't have a lot of long-term contracts, we have a generally open position. And that means that if we didn't do anything, our demand would be completely exposed to CAISO market prices. Sometimes the CAISO is the least expensive way to procure electricity to serve our demand, but as we learned in the energy crisis, it's not prudent to cross our fingers and just hope that things work out and that the energy is there, or that it's there at a reasonable price. And you know, we don't want to run out of energy and we don't want to face unreasonably high energy prices. So to mitigate those risks, we hedge. We enter into long-term transactions, short-term transactions, and fixed price energy hedges, which technically could be a long-term or a short-term transaction. So long-term transactions are long-term contracts typically for RPS resources. Short-term transactions, when we buy RECs for a few years, or when we do, 12-month fixed price energy purchase from a given counterparty. And then this fixed price energy purchase that I've referenced multiple times throughout the evening, they're typically short-term. They're typically a few months to 1 to 3 years long. And in these contracts, we're committing to buy electricity from a seller, someone like Morgan Stanley, or from an individual generator, where we agree to a volume of electricity, a schedule for the energy to be delivered, and we lock in the price associated with this transaction. The price we pay is typically a premium on what we think the CAISO market prices will be during the period of the transaction. If there wasn't a margin to be made, the seller wouldn't sell to us. But it's an insurance policy. We're closing off risk. They're making a profit. Everybody wins. Again, if we don't hedge our energy demand, we're fully exposed to the CAISO market, and that's a lot of risk. If we don't hedge our compliance obligations through long-term contracts, we're fully exposed to the unofficial markets for those products, and that's also a lot of risk. So now the table on the right is meant to provide an example of a common way we think about energy hedging. Please don't be tied to the numbers here. They are an example. But this framework is looking at price and volume targets for hedging. And so it's a price-based execution structure. So the notion here is that as prices go lower, we want to hedge. As prices go lower, demonstrating greater value, we want to hedge or execute more transactions at those lower prices. So if we're you know, if 0 is right now and then months to delivery, if right now is the delivery period, you know, if we go out a year, if prices are really low, we want to execute maybe 90% of our total open position at those prices because we think they're low. If prices are high, we would want to execute a lower portion of our open position at those high prices. And doing this over time allows us to try to take advantage of low prices and, you know, mitigate or lessen our exposure to high prices. So that's at a high level how we think about hedging our energy open position. Focusing our attention on the risks associated with having an open demand position. As I said, we can enter into short-term or long-term transactions. The short-term transactions are a few months to a few years. You know, we say that a short-term hedge could be as much as 5 years. That's pretty uncommon actually in California. In other parts of the country where there isn't an organized energy market, these 5 or 5 year plus transactions for an energy hedge are more likely, and that's because sellers, including utilities, are more speculative and they're able to make a profit on those transactions. It's less common in the California marketplace. A long-term RPS contract is a form of a long-term hedge. It's just not the same as a fixed price transaction where we're getting that specific volume of delivery on a specific schedule. So yeah, I think those are the points that I wanted to make on this slide. This slide shows an example of what our actual energy position was on a specific date last summer. This was on June 15th of 2019. As you all know, none of our long-term renewable resources are online and generating yet. So we had all of these orange bars were transactions that we had entered into in the form of fixed price energy hedges. We had a lot of these transactions on our books, and you see that there was just a minimal amount of open exposure that was exposed to the CAISO market. Here's another example from just this past January. Not the exact same hedges, different hedges, but a minimal amount of open exposure to the CAISO energy market. This slide, whereas before I showed you examples of a hypothetical day and a hypothetical portfolio in 5 years in the future, it's the same demand curve, but this is what our portfolio looks like for the future as of right now. This is the amount of generation we have from solar and the amount of generation we have from wind. Obviously, we're not going to leave it like this. It's for all of the reasons that we've already discussed. We actually will be going to market this fall and looking to execute more long-term contracts, and we'll be looking to make decisions informed by the IRP analysis that we're doing right now and that we'll talk about with you more in the coming months. But just wanted to let you know, we will be looking to fill this open position, not just with long-term renewable contracts, but with fixed price hedges, additional generating resources, and with dispatchable energy storage. And here's what our existing portfolio of resources looks like on the same July 14th load date in 2024. So, even just the current amount of solar we have fills up a lot more of our demand 5 years out. So you might be asking yourselves, why don't you just go out and execute a bunch of long-term contracts now? Because then you don't have to worry about doing these fixed price energy transactions. You just manage the different generating resources. The reason we don't go out and just sign a ton of long-term contracts now is partly what Tim talked about, the declining value of resources, uncertainty around the market value, uncertainty around the prices that the resources will be at in the future. And also we look at PG&E as a cautionary tale. PG&E years ago did a very good job of filling up their RPS compliance position. Then they started losing a bunch of customers, and they ended up having way more supply resources than demand for those resources. They also executed a lot of contracts between 2002 and 2011 when things were incredibly expensive. And then they started losing customers, and they were less able to go out and execute more contracts when prices were much more affordable in the 2015 to 2018 timeframe. To the extent that we can, we want to take advantage of what we think will be declining prices of different resource types over time. And we don't want to get too far ahead of our required position. The table on the right is showing if we have, for compliance period 4, these are the actual RPS targets. If our retail sales forecast was 7,000 megawatt hours, and then suddenly between 2025 and 2026, it decreased. Let's say we lost a bunch of our largest customers to direct access. We'd still be able to meet our RPS requirement of 49% RPS energy. We'd still be able to meet the long-term contracting requirement that 65% of the target has to be from long-term resources, but we'd end up having more long-term resources than we actually need. Now, this is a risk that we are going to have to take because we have to lock in those long-term resources in this compliance period 4 window. So if we lose a bunch of customers in the future, we end up having more long-term contracts than we need, but we're not way above our RPS compliance amounts. So that's why we're not going to try to totally fill our open position now with long-term contracts. It puts us at risk if we lose customers in the future. And whether customers join or whether customers leave us is something that the Power Resources team and our colleagues in the marketing and account services team, it's just something that we have to very actively manage and do the best we can to entice customers to stay with us. I'm not going to spend time talking about this slide because of Tim's the great description that he just provided. This is just another way of looking at overgeneration, largely associated with solar resources. So some other challenges, just besides the potential risk associated with over procurement, is our challenges associated with resource adequacy. I've talked about the fact that the resource adequacy rules are constantly changing. It creates a risk that the resources that we execute contracts with are not as valuable at some point in the future as we thought they were at the time that we executed the agreements. It also puts us at risk that we could be meeting our compliance obligations today, and tomorrow, if there's a rule change, we could suddenly have a shortfall. Now, there is typically some lead time on these rule changes, but they can happen in a sense, they can happen pretty abruptly, and we can be left with an open position where we previously thought that we were well set up. Wrapping up, this is actually my last slide. So what is the approach that we take to overall risk mitigation? Again, focusing on the supply and demand risk associated with energy. We don't try to beat the market. I think that Tim's presentation did a good job of demonstrating for one thing, we're a public entity. We exist to serve our customers. We are not in the business of trying to make a profit. And in California, you don't make money on the sale of the electric commodity anyway. So what we're really trying to do is manage costs and keep costs down for our customers as much as we possibly can. Setting the goal of earning a profit on our transactions, I think Tim effectively demonstrated that's pretty unlikely, but we can be very active in managing costs and trying to keep costs down and trying to prevent surprise costs for our customers. To do that, we are trying to put in place risk management systems and that are very disciplined and involve a lot of oversight. That's oversight from staff and senior leadership, Howard and Nick. It's also oversight from our risk oversight committee and from you, from members of the board. We try to cost average our transactions over time so that we can cover market fluctuations for short-term hedges. We also try to cost average over time so that we're taking advantage of technological advancements associated with these long-term projects. 4-hour lithium-ion energy storage can serve as a hedge, and we're excited about the future potential of longer-term or longer duration storage resources. All of the conversation today, I think, really demonstrates the value of having a diverse technology or diverse set of technologies of resources in our portfolio. Technologies, the durations of the resources, the geographies of these resources, and also, not going in too much with a single counterparty. There are many, many good counterparties in this space, and we don't want to be overly indentured to a single entity. And then lastly, making sure that our policy team continues to be as active and engaged and effective in the regulatory and legislative spaces as they have been. And that's, I'm referring to EBCE's policy team, but also the support that we get through being a part of CalCCA. And that is everything that I had.
Well,
any questions?
Great wrap up, Marie. Thank you so much. If anyone has any questions, if you could go ahead and use the raise hand feature or just speak up. Ed San Leandro?
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. Very detailed. Just trying to absorb as much as I could throughout the whole period. Really appreciate understanding the cost benefits, the value of solar going down, storage up, and then being a self-hedge there. And then really trying not to play the market, but rather make sure you minimize that risk where you can by getting some long-term contracts that maybe when the value is down, it's time to execute more of it and not get into a position where PG&E sort of lost customers that had all these contracts, hence the PCIA that we're paying for today. For my only thought, and really appreciate it, I think for me to have a chance to play around with market scenarios, it's really hands-on modeling, like should I buy more solar like 2024, or should I get more storage, or should we invest something else? But give me a chance maybe in the breakout room in the Zoom environment to sort of model some situations, then maybe within the board members say, hey, who had the best optimal scenario? So something to really put our teeth into and really apply this modeling option so we can better get hands-on would be my only feedback. But a lot of good information, really appreciate it. But those were my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Member Hernandez. I don't see any other hands raised at this time. Is anyone who doesn't know how to do that, if you want to just speak up, we could take your question now. All right, not hearing anyone, I just want to thank Marie for hanging in there. This was a very in-depth presentation that you will have to do over and over again, as we'll hopefully have new representatives coming in over the years. And I want to thank Howard and Nick and the rest of staff and Tim Belden for his section as well. This was very informative. Thank you very much, especially for the wrap-up points, because it's important for the board to have those takeaways, because these are going to color a lot of the policy decisions that we're going to have in the near and long-term future. So thanks for hanging in there, everybody. It was a long one, but it did wrap up very neatly. And now we understand why it's such a complex job to mitigate risk in power procurement. So now there's going to be a test. There's no test, but staff is available. If you have lingering questions, I'm sure you can reach out to Marie and she'd be happy to answer them for you, and Howard as well. But I know I'm going to be reading this slide deck again, so thank you for providing that ahead of time. All right, with that, this meeting is, oh, I'm sorry, I've got one more item. Are there any board member or staff announcements? Thank you. All right, now I am adjourning this meeting. It is 6:52, and see you at the next one, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.